Olivia was alone in the cold, metallic silence of the operating room corridor. The shock of what had just happened still shook her body, and the ringing in her ears grew louder. The familiar voice rising from within her now echoed in her ears, cruel and repeating over and over. "You're just a nurse. You're just a nurse." These words reminded her of not only a title, but a boundary as well. She had just crossed that boundary. With a momentary impulse, feeling that something was wrong, she had intervened in the surgeon's work. Her hands were still trembling. She couldn't quite remember what had happened, but she knew something was off, and she had acted on her instincts. She had been rushed out of the operating room, left alone with no explanation. The green gown she wore now felt like a heavy burden. With every step, the thought gnawing at her grew stronger. What if that patient? What if they really died because of her? She leaned against the walls, trying to breathe, but her throat was tight. As the panic inside her grew, Olivia thought her life was over. Her career, her hard work, her dreams. Was it all going to end because of that one split-second decision? The air in the operating room was still. Olivia, with a gauze in her hand, had taken her usual place. The surgeon was focused, the team was in sync, everything was as it should be. This surgery, like the others, would go smoothly. At least that's what Olivia thought, until she heard that sound. The alarms blaring from the monitors suddenly raised the tension in the room. The line showing the heart rate began to fluctuate, and the sharp warnings from the machines brought everyone's attention to one point. What had been a smooth surgery up until that moment was suddenly shaken by an unknown complication. Olivia's eyes instinctively shifted to the patient's left wrist. At first, it was just a small bruise. Maybe it was an insignificant detail. But a few seconds later, when she looked back at the same spot, she noticed the bruise had noticeably grown and the veins around it had spread. Her eyes narrowed, and she swallowed. She had a deep feeling inside. It was as if time slowed down in that moment. The blood was clotting. She knew that. She wasn't sure, but her instincts urged her to act. What she thought, what she felt, she couldn't quite remember. All she knew was that she grabbed the scalpel, pressed it firmly on the bruise without even blinking, and cut. In an instant, blood shot out, and the sound from the monitors changed. The heart rate returned to normal, and the alarms fell silent. All of this had happened in just a few seconds, but to Olivia, it felt like a lifetime. In that moment, everyone froze. Eyes, unsure of what had happened, were now on her. And then, without a word, she was hurriedly taken out of the operating room. Olivia was left standing in the cold corridor. Had she saved a life with her instincts? Or had she made an irreversible mistake by overstepping her authority? Her fingertips still tingled. Her hands were shaking. Her breathing was uneven, and her stomach was in knots. She hadn't heard a single thing since leaving the room. No word about the patient's condition. No update on how the surgery had ended. Her whole body felt like it was locked up from the tension. She closed her eyes, but the images behind her eyelids wouldn't go away. The bruise, the dark color spreading through the veins, and the cry rising inside her. "You have to do something." She did, without hesitation. But now, at what cost? When she heard footsteps, for a moment, hope sparked. Maybe someone was coming to tell her the good news. Maybe the patient had survived, and it had all just been a misunderstanding. But when she saw the two managers looking at her, that hope turned into an icy fear. There was no explanation, no understanding in their eyes. Just cold, emotionless stares, frozen with a sense of duty. "Olivia, you need to come with us." Her heart pounded in her chest as she nodded slightly and fell into step with them. It felt like she wasn't walking, but being dragged along. With every step, another knot formed in her throat. The further they moved away from the operating room, the more her heart clenched. Every corner they turned isolated her a little more. It felt like she was being removed from a crime scene. But all she had wanted was to save a life. When the management office door opened, Olivia felt the cold air inside. She stepped in, and the sound of the door closing behind her seemed to seal away the last of her hope. The manager sitting behind the desk had an expressionless face. He looked at his file, then turned his eyes to Olivia. It was like he was looking at a stranger. Yet, Olivia had dedicated years to this hospital. Night shifts, crying family members, emergencies, risky surgeries. All of it was erased in an instant. "Your behavior today is a serious breach of protocol," the manager said, his voice cold as ice. Your unauthorized intervention during surgery was beyond your authority. It has been considered a behavior that endangered patient safety. Olivia wanted to say something. She tried to speak, but she began, her vocal cords strained. Something was wrong. In that moment, I had no other choice. The manager shook his head. This is not open for discussion. The decision was made the moment you were removed from the operating room. Effective immediately, you are terminated from your position. It happened so fast. It was so final. No questions, no chance to defend herself. Olivia suddenly felt like a word that had lost all meaning. Alone, worthless, misunderstood. And worst of all, she had been thrown out without even knowing what had happened. Had the patient survived? Had her intervention actually worked? She didn't know. As she left the office, her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She didn't cry because this pain couldn't be expressed with tears. She walked down the corridor with that heavy weight inside her, heading toward the hospital exit. A few hours ago, she had been on duty. Now, standing outside this building that felt foreign, the sky was gray. It felt like everything had gone silent with her. And in that moment, Olivia felt this. The greatest pain wasn't losing her job. It was being sent away without knowing she might have saved a life. The sharp sound of the door closing sent a shiver through Olivia. When she stepped out through the hospital's large glass door, the wind that hit her face burned not just with its cold, but with the meaning it carried. That place was no longer hers. The hands that held the scalpel, the hallway she had spent years in, the faces she knew, all of it was now behind her. And everything had gone silent. When she arrived home, she paused for a few seconds, key in hand, without turning it. Maybe everything was still the same behind that door, but Olivia was a completely different person now. It was as if the life she had built over the years had been shattered in a few hours. She opened the door, took off her shoes, and sat down on the couch without even removing her coat. Her back hunched, her eyes lost in emptiness. The night of that day never ended. As the first light of morning streamed through the window, Olivia was still in the same spot. It wasn't just the hours that had stopped. Time itself seemed to have frozen. Days passed, but the weight she felt inside, the one she'd carried from that first day, never lightened. She turned on the TV. Desperately, she began watching the news. Maybe the incident had made it to the media. Maybe there had been a statement. Maybe a miracle would happen, and she'd hear a sentence saying the patient was okay. But there was nothing. Nothing at all. Every day, there was a new scandal, a new development, a new headline on the screen. But not a single word about the surgery or the patient. It was as if it had never happened. As if everything Olivia experienced had been a product of her mind. She couldn't take it anymore. She started calling her old colleagues. Maybe one of them would tell her something. Maybe a message, a clue, but none of her calls were answered. No one returned her messages. Her phone stayed on silent. At first, she thought it was just a technical issue. Maybe they were busy. Maybe they would call back after a while. But as the days passed, she realized she had been abandoned. Completely. One morning, in desperation, she messaged an old cleaning staff member from the hospital. Maybe they knew something. A short time later, the one-word reply summed it all up. They told us not to speak. Olivia couldn't breathe in that moment. Her fingers gripped the phone tightly, but she couldn't stop the tremors inside her. The hospital management had instructed everyone not to communicate with her. All connections had been severed. It was as if she had committed a contagious crime, isolated and left alone. Days turned into weeks. While life outside continued as usual, time inside Olivia still felt frozen. Every morning, she woke up to the same silence, the same emptiness. She didn't open the curtains, didn't check her phone. There was no need to call anymore. She knew very well that no one would be calling her. In the early days, a voice inside her still whispered hope. Maybe someone would speak up. Maybe everything would come to light. Maybe someone would see the truth and call her back. But nothing changed. The silence just deepened. One morning, when she looked in the mirror, she couldn't recognize herself. Her hair was messy, her eyes red from sleeplessness. The bathrobe she was wearing had been on her for days. You need to snap out of this, she told herself. You have to do something. She opened her computer. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She hesitated to type anything related to nursing. She opened a job board, stared at it, but a strange anxiety overwhelmed her. Every listing reminded her of a world that no longer belonged to her. Every hospital name, Every "must be able to handle high-pressure environments" phrase created a knot in her throat. Whenever she tried to apply, the same scene replayed in her mind. The cold corridor, the management office, her life breaking like a pencil. She pressed the close button. The screen went black. Olivia sat still in her chair for a while. Then, she opened the computer again. This time, she searched for something different. Waiter wanted. Then, cashier jobs. Then, home packing jobs. There was a deep shame inside her, but that wasn't what broke her. What truly hurt was not being able to even reach out to the profession she had dedicated years to. She had loved nursing. She really had. Helping people, touching their lives. What she did that day, whether it was right or wrong, she didn't know, but the instinct inside her had been real. She had wanted to save a life. Now, she was filling out a job application to carry coffee cups. I'm not that person anymore, she thought to herself. There's no more Olivia the nurse. Now, there's just someone looking for a job. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the send button. She left the previous job field blank. She didn't have the courage to fill it out. After the loneliness, the uncertainty, and the falling of a dream, Olivia was turning the page to a completely different chapter of her life. But she still didn't know who she was on that page or where to begin. The sky was gray that day. The pale light filtering through the window left tired shadows in the corners of the room. Olivia sat at the kitchen table, staring at a half-finished cup of coffee. It had been hours since she gave up on looking at job listings. The silence had settled into every corner of the house. Everything was stagnant, just like the way she felt inside. At that moment, the doorbell rang. It was an unexpected sound. She wasn't expecting a delivery, nor a visitor. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she got up. With hesitant steps, she approached the door. Without looking through the peephole, she cracked it open. Standing in front of her was a man in his mid-30s, dressed neatly, his face familiar, yet somehow distant. His gaze was serious, yet soft. There was a depth to his eyes. "Nurse Olivia?" he asked, his voice calm, but carrying a certain weight. Olivia froze for a moment. Her eyes narrowed. "Yes," she said cautiously. Her heart raced. Who was this man? How did he know her name? The man slowly rolled up the cuff of his left sleeve and revealed his wrist. Right there, the place where the bruise had been. It had healed now, but a thin, barely visible scar remained. A mark that had faded with time, but hadn't disappeared. Olivia's eyes widened. Her hands began to tremble involuntarily. For a few seconds, she couldn't speak or even breathe. This is you," she whispered almost inaudibly. The man tilted his head slightly. "Yes," he said. "That day, you were in the operating room." Olivia's throat tightened. She took a step back, pressing her hand against the doorframe. The world suddenly felt small. She was face to face with the living answer to the question she had been seeking for so long. The truth was no longer silent. "You survived," Olivia said, her eyes filling with tears. The man smiled. "Yes, I'm alive, thanks to you." With those words, all the guilt, shame, and fear that had weighed on Olivia vanished. Tears flowed down her cheeks without her even realizing it. The burden she had carried for weeks suddenly lifted. She struggled to stay standing. I only," she started, but the words failed her. She didn't know what to say. The man took a step forward. "You saved me. Even though the doctors questioned your intervention that day, I know the truth, and I came to thank you." Olivia's eyes were still fixed on his wrist. That small scar, the mark of those few seconds that had changed her profession, her life, her identity. And now, that scar was not a sign of a catastrophe, but proof of a miracle. "I'm Lucas," he said in a soft voice. "I was the patient lying on the operating table that day." Olivia's lips parted, but she couldn't say anything. His name, his face, his voice. It was all real. Standing in front of her, he was the clearest proof she had seen in years. Olivia took a deep breath, but the air that filled her lungs didn't seem enough. Her heart was still pounding in her chest. Lucas continued speaking, his voice slightly trembling but filled with deep resolve. "The hospital is keeping everything a secret," he said. "After the surgery, they only told me general things, that there had been a complication, but that the situation had been brought under control at the last moment. But those answers didn't satisfy me. I wanted to know the truth." Olivia listened silently, unable to take her eyes off him. "I searched for days," Lucas continued. "Finally, I found a janitor who had been on duty that day in the operating room. He told me everything. He said that it was because of your intervention that I'm alive. That without a second thought, without hesitation, you saved my life. Lucas's voice trembled. He paused for a moment, locking eyes with Olivia. I'm so grateful, Olivia. Words can't express it. But the fact that you lost your job, the price you paid for this. I'm so sorry for that. Tears flowed freely down Olivia's cheeks now, unstoppable. In that moment, something broke inside her, but it wasn't from pain. The fear, the guilt, the feeling of worthlessness that she had carried for months just for a brief moment gave way to a deep sense of relief. Every word she heard seemed to lift a little more weight from her heart. In a quiet, warm tone, she spoke. Please, come in. Lucas nodded and stepped inside. After she closed the door, Olivia paused for a moment, turning around to see Lucas in her living room. It felt real, yet still unbelievable. They moved to the living room. Olivia, with trembling hands, brought 2 cups of tea from the kitchen. For the first time in weeks, she realized she could breathe again, with someone by her side. Seeing Lucas, knowing he was healthy, changed everything. The man whose life she had saved with a moment of courage was now standing at her door, thanking her. For a while, there was silence. But it wasn't the painful kind. It was a calming, healing silence. 2 people were now connected by an invisible bond. A moment spent between life and death had created an effect that would last for years. Olivia took a deep breath and smiled for the first time. A real smile. She whispered quietly, "You made me breathe again, Lucas." Lucas looked at Olivia and smiled softly. "You know," he said, his voice gentle, "after what happened that day, my family immediately took me to another country for rehab. Physically, I was fine, but I couldn't deal with that one question that kept spinning in my mind. What happened?" He tilted his head slightly. "My family." He paused for a moment. "Actually, I should have told you this from the start. My father, he owns a large health corporation. Maybe you've heard of it, Muller Holdings." Olivia's eyes widened in surprise. Yes, that name was familiar. She had seen it in newspapers, on the news, but now, she was in the same room as him. Lucas smiled. "I never liked that world. The flashy parties, the big speeches. But today, for the first time, I want to use those resources for a real purpose." Olivia's eyes began to well up, and Lucas became more serious. "What you did that day saved my life. But it didn't just save me, it changed the way I see life. While everyone was punishing you, I realized something very clearly. Sometimes, breaking the rules takes courage. And that courage saves lives. What happened to you shouldn't have. You shouldn't have been punished, your talent should have been recognized." He leaned forward, his voice softening. "That's why I have an offer. I told my family your story. Everyone, including my father, agreed on how special you are. And we want to support you." Olivia's eyes filled with tears. She was about to say something, but Lucas continued. "Abroad, at a private medical school. It's high-quality, one-on-one education, a place that really prepares its students. We will cover all the expenses. Tuition, accommodation, living costs, all of it. All you need to do is dream again." A silence fell. Olivia lowered her head. Something inside her stirred. A part of her she had forgotten, suppressed, something she had pushed aside years ago. The little girl who got excited every time she saw someone in a white coat. The one who used to examine her sibling with a toy doctor's kit. "I'm going to be a doctor when I grow up," she had once told her mother. Then life had led her to nursing. She had loved her job, but that deep dream, it had always quietly lived inside her. Now, someone was offering her that dream back. "Lucas," she said, her voice soft. "This is a huge thing. I don't know. I don't even know if I deserve all of this." Lucas shook his head. "You deserve it, Olivia. Every second of it. But the decision is yours. Just know this, you're not alone." Olivia paused for a moment. The storm inside her was growing. Fears, hopes, the shadows of the past, and the light of the future were all blending together. In that moment, she was sure of one thing. Life was offering her a second chance. And this time, it was hard to ignore. Lucas met Olivia's hesitant gaze with a determined look, offering her a sense of security, as though Olivia were hearing her own inner voice for the first time from someone else. "Sometimes life only gives us one chance to change direction," Lucas said. "You gave me a second life that day. Now it's your turn. This is your dream, Olivia. Don't let your past chain you down. You're a doctor by birth. You just had to reach the right place." These words echoed within Olivia. With tears in her eyes, she lowered her head. A brief silence followed. Then, she whispered softly, "Okay, I accept." A joy spread across Lucas's face so brightly that Olivia felt all the fears inside her vanish in that moment. One decision, one step, and a whole new path was now stretched before her. Months later, Olivia was on the campus of the private medical school abroad. Everything felt foreign at first. The language, the culture, the people, but the purpose inside her overshadowed it all. Olivia entered every class with an eager mind, giving her best in every practice. As she regained belief in herself, she began to shine. It didn't take long for her to catch the attention of her instructors. They were impressed by her skills, instincts, and analytical thinking. She wasn't just learning medical knowledge, she was living it. Over time, the phrase "born to be a doctor" was truly becoming her reality. Years passed. Olivia was a completely different woman now. She had far surpassed the title once unfairly taken from her. She was no longer just a good doctor. She had become someone who truly understood what it meant to touch a life with her heart. And she shared her story at every opportunity. She spoke of where she came from, of the moment no one had heard her voice, when one person, Lucas, had believed in her. "It wasn't a scalpel that saved me, but faith," she would say. And years later, as she stepped out of the airport's exit gate on a sunny day, Olivia's eyes immediately found that familiar silhouette in the crowd. Lucas was there. He hadn't changed. Still the same posture, the same warm smile. When their eyes met, it felt as though time had stopped. Lucas took a few steps forward, not to grab his suitcase, but to embrace Olivia. "Welcome back," he said, his voice low but filled with emotion. "I'm back," Olivia replied. "But now, as someone completely different." Lucas nodded. "You were always that person. You just had to remember." Today, Olivia had become a doctor who saved countless lives. She was invited to global seminars, inspiring young doctors. Her story had been turned into books and documentaries. But she still began every telling with the same sentence. "The person who changed my life wasn't a doctor. It was someone who believed in me." And Lucas had dedicated his life to Olivia. He stood by her side, a silent but steadfast strength. They never rushed their love, for they both knew some bonds deepen not with time, but with lived experiences. Olivia was no longer just a name, but an inspiration. And it all had started with a heart that believed in one truth. If Olivia's inspiring journey touched you as well, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel to help spread this story to more people. I'm here every day with stories that touch on real emotions. I need your support to grow together. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes, a life can change with just one belief. See you soon.